Since I was a kid, I was taught that being the eldest son came with responsibilities. My parents, Maria and João, always said I had to set an example for my younger brother, Daniel. And that's exactly what I did. While Daniel spent his teenage years partying, wasting money on drinks, and getting into trouble, I worked hard. I got my first job as an intern at 16, and by the time I finished college, I had a stable job. I wasn't making a fortune, but it was enough to pay my bills and help my parents when they needed it. And trust me, they always needed it. The electricity bill was late. I paid it. Their car broke down. I covered the repairs. Even groceries. Many times, I paid for everything. I told myself it was my duty. After all, they had sacrificed so much for me. It was only fair to give back, right? Meanwhile, Daniel never had to lift a finger. He never helped with a single bill, never worried about money. My parents always made excuses for him. He's still figuring things out, they'd say. He'll get a job soon. But the years went by, and nothing changed. The worst part? I never complained. I thought I was doing the right thing, that one day my efforts would be appreciated. But I was so wrong. Final thought. We often give everything to our family expecting gratitude, but sometimes it never comes. It was just a regular day, one of those where you're casually scrolling through social media or checking some messages on your phone when everything changed. I never imagined I'd find something like this, something that would shake me to my core. I was at my parents' house, visiting like I always did on weekends. Maria was in the kitchen cooking lunch, and João was watching soccer in the living room, just like usual. I took the opportunity to go into their office, check out some things, and that's when I found it, an envelope, one that looked different from the others. It had a seal from the retirement fund, something related to the will, but it didn't make sense to me. My curiosity led me to open it. Inside was the will of Maria and João, something I never thought I'd see. As I began reading, I was frozen. They had left everything to Daniel. Everything. The house we lived in, the car, the money they had saved. Nothing was left for me. What I was looking at was an outright betrayal. I didn't know what to do. The first emotion I felt was anger, then desperation, and then emptiness. I asked myself, why did I spend all these years sacrificing myself when my brother has always had everything handed to him? I walked into the kitchen. I looked at Maria and João, and without being able to hold back, I said, I need to know what this is about. They didn't understand at first, but when I showed them the will, the room went completely silent. Son, Daniel needs it more than you. He doesn't have the stability you do. You've always had more opportunities. Those words spoken by my mom felt like a dagger. It wasn't a mistake. It was a deliberate choice. Daniel, upon hearing about my discovery, wasn't surprised. He looked at me and said, I've always known. You never needed anything. Wasn't it time to let me take charge? In that moment, I realized I wasn't really part of that family the way I thought I was. I was just someone meant to fix everyone else's problems without ever being acknowledged. What hurt more wasn't the inheritance itself, but the fact that they just turned their backs on me, as if my effort, love, and dedication meant nothing. Final thought, when you find out that the family you gave everything to doesn't see you the same way, the world turns upside down. It's a feeling of helplessness and betrayal that you never forget. After that day, I didn't know what to do. I wanted to scream. I wanted to explode, but I didn't even know where to start. The truth is, I was completely devastated. I've always been that son who sacrifices for everyone, and now, after all these years, everything I had done seemed to have no value at all. The pain was unbearable. The worst part wasn't the money or the assets left to Daniel, but the feeling of injustice. I've always given my best, always put in the effort, and when I reached my lowest point, I thought my parents would be there to support me. They weren't. They had emotionally abandoned me a long time ago, and I hadn't even realized it. They were more concerned with the idea that Daniel, who's always been the most irresponsible, needed it more than I did. I began to think about how Daniel never cared about anything. He always had everything handed to him, never had to face the consequences of his actions. He had his car paid for by my parents, food on the table, his tuition covered by them, and still, he never had to lift a finger to help. And now the inheritance, all for him. At that moment, I felt like all my sacrifices over the years had been in vain. I helped my parents all the time, while Daniel played the victim, the poor guy, and was never held accountable for anything. They told me the reason they left, the inheritance to him, was because he needed it more. I looked at that and didn't understand. Needed it for what? And that's when something inside me changed. I was no longer willing to keep playing the role of the good son. I didn't want to be the family bank anymore. I decided I was going to change my attitude, even if it meant creating a rift between me and them. I spent a few days thinking about everything, reflecting on what had happened, until I finally made a decision. I wasn't going to help with anything anymore. This was harder than I imagined, but deep down, I knew it was the right thing to do. I decided I wouldn't pay any more of the household bills, wouldn't help with my father's medical expenses, wouldn't cover anything related to their financial life. I knew this would be a shock for everyone, especially Daniel, but I didn't care anymore. I had reached my limit. I was no longer the good brother, the son who fixes everything. First, it seemed simple. I felt strong, ready to take control of the situation. But deep down, a part of me was still trying to convince myself that this decision wouldn't be as drastic as it seemed. The first reaction from my parents was complete surprise. They didn't know how to react and immediately started asking, "Why are you doing this? You were always the one who helped us." I calmly replied with a firm voice, "Now it's Daniel's turn. He's the one who should handle the expenses he and you created." My brother, of course, was offended. He didn't understand why I wasn't willing to help anymore. "You can't do this, Lucas. We're family." And that's when it became clear to me. I was the only one in the family who truly cared about everyone else, and I was always treated like a savior, never like someone who also has their own needs. But I stood firm. From that moment on, my life would take a new direction. I wasn't going to be the wild card they used whenever they needed something. Final thought: sometimes the best way to love your family is by setting boundaries. They might not understand at first, but it will be the best thing for everyone in the long run. The following days were tough. I never imagined that a seemingly simple decision to stop helping could create such a huge amount of tension. My family, as a whole, seemed to be in shock. Daniel's reaction was immediate. He began treating me as if I were the villain of the story. But what surprised me the most was my parents' response. Maria and João tried at all costs to make me feel guilty. Every day, my mom would send messages saying we needed to think about the family and that it wasn't the time to create conflicts. But at the same time, I knew she was trying to manipulate my conscience to make me go back. She was doing this not because she cared about me, but because the idea that Daniel might have financial problems made her extremely anxious. I, on the other hand, was determined. I wasn't going to be the son who was always there to fix everything. But Daniel's messages started to intensify. He began sending me texts full of accusations, saying I was being selfish, that our family was falling apart because of me. The tone of his messages was aggressive and even threatening. I realized he didn't understand, or didn't want to understand, my point of view. For him, it was always about, I deserve more. And somehow he was trying to make me feel like I had no right to be dissatisfied with the situation. In the midst of all this, the big question that haunted me was, how far does loyalty to family go when it causes you so much pain? I was so tired of being their emotional support that I began to question if this really made sense. I didn't want to be a doormat anymore. I didn't need that. I deserved to be recognized. But the final confrontation was still ahead. It wasn't enough for me to make the decision to stop helping. What I didn't know was that my family's next steps would be even more aggressive. As the days went by, I realized that the pressure on me was only increasing. The decision to stop helping wasn't just a shift in my financial life. It was affecting the entire family dynamic. It was like I had thrown a bomb into the middle of the room, and everyone, especially Daniel, was in shock, trying to figure out how to react. My mom kept sending me messages, but now they were more direct and at the same time, more desperate. I couldn't ignore them anymore because the situation was becoming unbearable. In one of those messages, she said something that really hit me. "Lucas, you're abandoning us. How can you do this to your mother and father? After everything we've done for you?" I knew this was an attempt to make me feel guilty. But deep down, those words struck me in a way I didn't expect. I knew Maria was scared of losing everything she had, scared that Daniel would finally be forced to face the consequences of his irresponsibility. João, on the other hand, was quieter, but I knew he was frustrated as well. He was never good with words, but his actions spoke louder than any speech. And it was under this pressure that something inside me finally snapped. I was so tired of being the good son, of being the son who fixes everything, of being the hero of the family. When would I get to be myself? When would I get to live my life without being manipulated by everyone? I decided that I wouldn't be the villain of the story anymore. No matter how much they tried to blame me, the blame wasn't mine. The blame was on Daniel, who had always been protected, and on my parents, who never realized I had needs. 2, I was tired of being the source of money and emotional support. And then the worst happened. Daniel took to social media to air everything publicly. He posted a photo of us at my parents' house with the caption, "I think the family needs a new hero. If you think the only one in the wrong here is me, then you don't know the whole story." That was the last straw. Daniel's post on social media had a much bigger impact than I could have imagined. At that moment, my life turned into a public spectacle. The last thing I wanted was for my family to be exposed like this. But I knew things had gotten out of control. Daniel used his social media to attack me, turning me into the villain of the story, while he and my parents tried to maintain the image of perfection. Through those words, they were attempting to destroy me publicly, and worse, manipulate others into thinking I was the one responsible for the mess. When I saw the post, I felt a mixture of anger and sadness. Daniel was trying to distort the reality. He wasn't just lying about my decision to stop helping. He was trying to convince everyone around that I had always been selfish and insensitive. I saw many friends and even family members commenting, supporting his version. Most didn't know what was really going on behind the scenes, and those who did were, in some way, protecting the lie. But it wasn't just the post that affected me. Daniel also began sending messages to other members of our family, trying to twist the narrative in his favor. He sent texts to my uncles, cousins, even childhood friends, distorting everything I had done for them over the years. He was creating an image of a wicked brother who had turned his back on the family after being supported by them for so long. I knew the only way to stop this was to lay everything out on the table, once and for all. It wasn't enough to stop helping. It wasn't enough to cut the financial ties. I needed to reveal to the world how things really worked in our house. So, I decided I would make my own post. Something that would show the truth. Something that would tell my side of the story without filters. But I knew it wouldn't be an easy decision. The exposure would be even greater. But I was tired of living, with the weight of the lie on my shoulders. It was time to break the silence. I wanted everyone to know how I had been treated, how my kindness had always been seen as weakness, and how my patience had been mistaken for tolerance. So, on a Friday night, I posted it. I wrote a long message explaining my perspective, detailing every time I had been manipulated, abandoned, and used. I gave concrete examples, facts that no one could contest. I spoke about how Daniel had always been the favorite and how my parents had never given me the value I deserved. I mentioned the emotional manipulation, the lack of gratitude, and how it had affected my mental health over the years. At the end of the post, I said, "I'm not the villain. I'm the son who got tired of being invisible. And if that's enough to destroy my family, then maybe it's better if it happens now." My post on social media had an effect I never imagined. When I wrote it all down, I was determined to expose the truth and at the same time free myself from the constant pressure. What I didn't know was that by revealing everything, I was causing a wave of reactions that would forever change the way my family saw me, and perhaps the way I saw my family. The first reaction came from Daniel. It didn't take long for him to respond with an even more aggressive post, calling me a traitor, selfish, and liar. He was trying to manipulate friends and family into believing that I was just trying to destroy his image and our families. But what struck me the most was that this time, he wasn't trying to convince my parents anymore. He was attacking everyone around me, trying to turn the whole world against me. However, what I didn't expect were the messages of support I began receiving. Childhood friends, colleagues, and even distant relatives started speaking out, saying they were on my side. Some said they had suspected the family dynamics, but didn't have the courage to speak up. Others revealed that they knew about the manipulations happening behind the scenes, but never knew how to support me. It was a relief to know that somehow I wasn't alone. But at the same time, it brought an even greater weight: the impact on family relationships. When Maria and João finally called me, I realized things wouldn't be easy. My mom's voice was cold and distant. She said, "Lucas, you've gone too far. This will destroy our family." I tried to explain, tried to show that I could no longer live like this, but she didn't want to listen. Her words sounded like a sentence. "I don't know what to do with you now." Daniel and my parents began to see me as an enemy, someone who had betrayed their trust. But what hurt the most was that even after everything, Maria was still unwilling to see the truth. She would rather believe the lie Daniel had created than accept that I was simply trying to find my peace. I withdrew even further. I spent days not answering the phone, not replying to messages. Each attempt to contact my parents felt more like a plea for forgiveness than a conversation. I felt that deep down, they weren't really worried about me. They were more concerned with keeping up the facade of a perfect family. That's when Daniel started playing with guilt. In one of his most recent messages, he said, "Do you have any idea how much this is affecting our family? How can you be so insensitive?" For a moment, I thought about responding, but then I realized it no longer made sense to try to justify something that was already so clear to me. I didn't need their approval anymore. I didn't need anything that involved this toxic dynamic. The weeks following my post were a whirlwind of emotions. I was sure that the truth had finally been told, but the reality was much more painful than I had imagined. The distance between me and my family grew with each passing day, and it seemed that despite all the support I had received from friends and acquaintances, I was more isolated than ever. Daniel and my parents no longer spoke to me directly, but every time I checked my phone, there were more and more passive-aggressive messages on social media. Daniel continued to attack me publicly, but now he started relying on an even more manipulative narrative. Lucas was always the rebellious child, the ungrateful one. He never knew how to value our family. He spoke about me as if I were a complete stranger, someone who had nothing to do with the family that had grown up in that house. Maria and Joan's messages also became rarer. When my mom called to ask how I was doing, the tone of the conversation was distant and cold. She tried to hide it, but I knew she was trying to find a way to get me to give in, to convince me that I was wrong, and that in the end, I would be the one who lost the most from all of this. She was always good at using guilt, convincing me that my happiness should never come before theirs. It was at this moment that I realized something very important. My real battle was no longer with Daniel or my parents. My battle was internal. I was fighting the fear of being alone, the idea that my family was the only thing I had in life. For years, I had accepted that their approval was essential to my happiness. And now I had to deal with the emptiness that grew as that relationship disintegrated. But deep down, I knew I was doing the right thing. Every time I distanced myself, every time I refused another attempt at emotional manipulation, I felt a lightness I hadn't known before. I was no longer tied to expectations that were never mine. Eventually, Daniel and my parents began to realize that the world around us wasn't as simple as they had imagined. People started questioning their version of things. Friends, co-workers, even other family members began to distance themselves, seeing how they tried to control everything and everyone. Some even sent me messages saying they saw in me the courage they lacked to take a stand in situations like this. The tension was still in the air, but one thing was certain. I was stronger. I knew that, regardless of what happened with my family, I couldn't go back. What I had learned through all of this was that my peace of mind mattered more than any toxic family bond. And in the end, I had the right to live my life without the chains of guilt. The final point came in a conversation I had with Daniel. He tried once again to manipulate me, saying he was losing his brother and that I should think about the consequences for everyone. But this time, my answer was clear and final. I'm not losing anything. I'm gaining. I'm gaining my freedom. Hey everyone, have you ever been through something like this? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more videos like this, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell so you won't miss anything. Oh, and if you haven't watched the previous video, click here and check it out. I'm sure you'll be surprised. Go ahead, share your thoughts, and let's keep the conversation going.